over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Hi there, welcome to Brazier. Fast-paced news from 4 until 6. In the next hour, a very good day. In Devon, the £500,000 discovery of a gold coin last found 260 years ago. Also, why the Royal Navy won't push back migrants in the English Channel, after all. And should British police protect Prince Harry after stepping away from the royals? We'll have the debate. But first, the news headlines with Miranda.
Thank you, Colin. Good afternoon. Your top stories this hour. Boris Johnson has denied lying to Parliament, insisting he believed a gathering in Number 10's garden during lockdown was a work event. His former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, says he's prepared to swear under oath that the Prime Minister lied to MPs when he said he didn't know beforehand about the garden party in May 2020. During a visit to a North London hospital, the Prime Minister said he regrets the drinks events held in Number 10.
I want to begin by repeating my apologies to everybody for the misjudgments that I've made, that we may have made in Number 10 and beyond, whether in Downing Street or throughout the pandemic. Categorically, that nobody told me and nobody said that this was something that was against the rules, that was a breach of the COVID rules, or we were doing something that wasn't a work event.
The COVID restrictions introduced in Scotland to reduce the spread of the Omicron variant will be lifted next week. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announced that from Monday, nightclubs can reopen and there will be no limits on the number of people who can go to indoor events. Social distancing rules will be scrapped and there will be no requirement of table service in restaurants. Ms Sturgeon warned people should remain cautious, though, keeping gatherings as small as possible and taking lateral flow tests before meeting up.
A combination of booster vaccinations, the willingness of the public to adapt their behaviour to help stem transmission and the temporary protective measures introduced in December has helped blunt the impact of the Omicron wave. The rise in cases driven by Omicron peaked in the first week of January, and that we are now on the downward slope of this wave of cases.
Police investigating the death of Ashley Murphy have arrested a man in his 30s on suspicion of murder. Earlier this afternoon, huge crowds gathered for the funeral of the primary school teacher in County Offaly in Ireland. Her pupils lined the streets holding instruments and photos. Irish Taoiseach Micheál Martin and President Michael D. Higgins were both in attendance. The 23-year-old was killed while running along the Grand Canal in Tullamore. A British gunman who took 4 hostages at a Texas synagogue was previously investigated by MI5. Malik Faisal Akram from Blackburn in Lancashire was investigated in 2020, was assessed to no longer be a threat at the time he travelled to the United States. He was shot and killed after a 10-hour standoff with police and SWAT officers. No one else was injured. 3 adults and 2 children have been arrested in connection with a stabbing in York. There were 2 women aged 40 and 18, a man aged 40 and 2 children aged 15 and 12, all from York. Police say the violent incident happened on Saturday afternoon. A 44-year-old man was injured and taken to hospital by ambulance. Officers say all 5 who were arrested have been released on conditional bail, pending further inquiry. Downing Street is considering whether to bring back plans to clamp down on noisy protests. It follows a string of defeats for the government in the House of Lords last night over its police crime sentencing and courts bill. Peers backed a Labour amendment scrapping the power to impose conditions on marches judged to be too loud. The bill now returns to the Commons for further debate. Baroness Claire Fox told GB News the right to protest should be legally protected.
The government asked the Lords to start deciding law by bringing them in, trying to sneak them in through the Lords in November. You basically got ministers standing up saying, well, we will allow you to do that if you behave. And you do think, I'm sorry, it's our right to protest that's legal. You have to now justify when you make it illegal. And they didn't justify it. That's the reality. And they, as a consequence, were humiliated.
The Prime Minister has warned that President Vladimir Putin must not be allowed to rewrite the rules over Ukraine amid continued tensions. Britain is supplying further self-defence weapons to Ukraine over concerns about a possible Russian invasion. UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says a small number of personnel will also provide training to Ukrainian forces, but stressed that British troops will not be deployed to fight Russians. British #1 star Emma Raducanu has won her first-round Australian Open match in 3 sets. The 19-year-old tennis star beat America's Sloane Stephens. She fought back from losing the second set 6-2 to win the third. Well, this is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, let's get back to Brazier.
Hi there, giving the news a twist on this episode of Brazier. The great dividing line in the Tory party was Europe. Is it now green energy and the cost of living crisis? Are you a patriot? What makes your chest swell with national pride, if anything? We consider why some people find our decision to play the national anthem every morning distasteful. And our Twitter poll, do you agree with the scientist who says young women are storing up trouble for the future by avoiding a meat-based diet? Well, Britain could face 2 big energy price rises this year, with bills reaching £2,255 from October on average. Economists also expect inflation to reach a 30-year high from April, and that means, put together, households face a possible £3,000 average spending increase in 2022. Get tightening those belts, crikey. The news comes as the Resolution Foundation think tank yesterday warned that more than a quarter of families will be driven into what it describes as fuel poverty in April when energy prices rise. Well, joining me, the Conservative MP for South Thanet, that is Craig McKinley. Craig McKinley, thanks ever so much for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate your time. When you spell it out in bald numbers like that, a £3,000 increase in household bills, I mean, Lordy, that's a lot of money.
It most certainly is. I don't think we've seen this level of inflation hitting households, probably on the energy side of things, since the 1973 oil crisis. But we have to sort of think this is in 2 phases. It's the here and now problem. We've got a here and now problem of a price rise that we've never seen before. Probably 50% is estimated coming our way on the 1st of April. The government has got some things it can do about that. It can obviously pay out money in higher warm homes discounts and those type of amounts of money to the lower paid. But we've got a long-term problem. I mean, there's no point having a short-term solution for this year when we're ignoring that we've got a long-term problem with energy supply. Now,
Craig,
are we going to keep going up this route?
Just break it down. Sorry, Craig, just to break it down, we'll come on to the long-term stuff in a second, but just on the short-term stuff, it does seem that the government faces a choice. It can offer things like the cold weather subsidies to people on benefits. It can perhaps even effectively cross-subsidise wholesale price rises for the energy companies. That's potentially a lot of money, but that's about spending taxpayers' money. the reverse of that is we look at tax cuts, things like cutting VAT on fuel. Where do you stand on that?
Oh, no, I've been supporting the cut of VAT on fuel for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's fairly easy to do. It's very understandable. And, of course, it's a Brexit dividend, and we haven't seen, in my view, enough of those thus far. But we must not forget there is a 23.5% levy on electricity bills relating to the renewables, the push for renewables and subsidising them because they're proving themselves to be incapable of producing energy at a reasonable price. And the problem is with this long-term policy is that we are committing the UK to having perpetually high energy prices while the rest of the world simply does not. But yeah, the government has got very limited ammunition this time round. It will probably do something. I don't think there's any doubt about that, whether it will be a sort of a loan scheme to the energy companies or there will be a payout to householders. Or, and I hope that these do form part of it, a cut in VAT and a cut in the green levies, if not only just for a temporary period. So they're the things that it can do here and now. But I mean, I've got a feeling we're going to be here next year in October when there's another price cap set, and next April when there's another price cap set. So we can't continue these sort of energy hikes for very long. Because, I mean, let's be honest, this isn't a discretionary spend. This is the basic right to have hot water and a warm environment. This isn't too much to ask. And frankly, where we're going with energy policy is failing on all of those measures.
When it comes to energy policy, does the failing lie at the door of previous governments, including previous Conservative governments? I mean, when we talk about the green energy mix and we think about maybe, I think it's fair to say, I would certainly say, the lack of investment in nuclear energy, an unwillingness to stare down some of those opposed to shale gas, and we see what that did to the American economy. Do you feel long-term mistakes have been made by Conservative politicians?
Oh, I think there's been mistakes across all administrations. Obviously, the Blair government allowed the whole nuclear policy to run into the sand. We are going to face a real difficulty at the end of this decade. When the current nuclear power stations, I think we might be left with only one by the end of the decade, because these things take a long time to build. There's good talk now about small modular and other nuclear power stations, but they take 10 years to come on stream. Now, the fact is, it's funny, the US is now coming to the rescue of Europe once more by piling ships full of LNG. Well, I mean, no matter what your view is on net zero and the whole CO2 issue, it can't make much sense to be shipping LNG around the world, whether it's from Qatar or the US. Mother Nature gave us a great gift in the UK, and that is a lot of gas. It seems to me, no matter what your view on these things, and the use of gas might be on a diminishing trajectory, we have enough self-supply, should we look into it, to actually match that. I found a very, very interesting chart from the House of Commons Library just last week. It showed that we've reduced our gas use in the UK over the last 20 years by 15%, but we've managed to halve our gas production, and we have got oodles of it. That makes no sense to me. So I'm quite happy to accept a diminishing use of fossil fuels over time, but when we've got them in the ground, available, that would help stop that price instability, would give us energy security, it would give affordability, it just seems to me a mad policy not to exploit that.
Craig McKinley, good of you to join us. Really appreciate your time. Thanks a lot. Let us know what you think of that story. What should the government do? Is it just about wholesale fuel prices? What about the fact that national insurance contributions are going up by £300 a year? Should that happen? How would you pay for the hole left in the tax receipts if you were to scrap it? Let us know. The Royal Navy is not expected to implement the new Home Office policy of pushing back migrant dinghies towards France once the senior service is given responsibility for unlawful small boat channel crossings. Admiralty sources said last night that senior naval officers had little interest in carrying out the policy of turning back boats, but put forward by Priti Patel, the Home Secretary. That being the case, then how will numbers be stemmed, or will the military simply encourage more to set off in the first instance? Joining us, the founder and lawyer at First Migration, that is Dean Morgan. Dean Morgan, appreciate your time. Thanks ever so much for joining us. Just on that final point there, that actually by placing more naval assets in the Channel, there may be a possibility we actually encourage more people to make the journey because they'll be safe in the knowledge there'll be more hands to bear them to English shores.
I mean, that potentially could be the case, but to be honest, I don't think it would be, though, because at the moment, the reason that people are making that journey is because they think they will succeed at actually arriving on British shores. The government needs to be taking some kind of policy that's going to try and stem the tide of this. And the only way you're going to do that is to try and deter people from doing it. But you're right, if the Royal Navy is going to be a taxi service to help people across the Channel, to bring them here to be processed here, then potentially that could be an encouragement for them. But I understand that the government's looking at trying to process applications for asylum or refugee status outside of the UK, in which case, then obviously it would be more of a deterrent, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, people get the logic of that, Dean, don't they? They get the logic that says, OK, more Royal Navy ships, more ships in the Channel to pick people up. The point where it breaks down is that we then return to Dover or other ports, and those people enter a very dysfunctional asylum-seeking process. I think there's a lot of support for the idea of saying, OK, third-party processing. I mean, this is not just the stuff of headbanger regimes. It's something that's been pursued by the Danish government, centre-left government in Denmark. They've signed a memorandum of understanding with a Central African country. So this is something that people approve of, but every time it's floated by the Home Office, people shake their heads and say, no, it's just one of those silly Home Office ideas. It'll never come off.
You know, last year there was 28,000 people, tried to make it across and got across the Channel. Hundreds of people die. It's a big business. It's a black economy, and people make a lot of money out of it. But this problem is only going to get worse. I mean, if you look at Afghanistan, they're facing massive problems now with an economic collapse. We've got the winter, so there's not, the migrants are not moving at this stage. But when it comes to the spring, there's potentially be a mass migration through Europe. People travel through a lot of countries to get to the UK, and you have to ask yourself why. This problem's not going to get better, and what we've been doing is clearly not working, because I think it was a 30% increase on the year before for the amount of people trying to get across. And 30,000 people, you think of a small town in the UK that has a population of 30,000, that gives you some idea how many people a year are coming across. So we need to come up with better solutions, and one of them has to be to try to deter people from making that journey. Because if you fled from Africa or you fled from Asia, how many countries for safe passage have you gone through that have a valid asylum system, that don't persecute you, that can offer you safety? 15, 10 countries. And so, what we're doing at the moment isn't working. It is encouraging more people to come. You can see that in the figures. So we need to come up with more novel solutions. People don't like the idea of what Australia did by putting people on an island. I think that the country has a duty of care, though, that if you do that, you've got to have a robust system to process these claims efficiently, quickly, make a decision, and then obviously allow people in that have the right to stay here, and then move people back to their home countries for repatriation if they don't.
Dean Morgan, appreciate your time.
What we're doing isn't working.
Again.
So we need some...
Sorry, Dean, we've done. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Now, a metal detectorist has found what is believed to be one of England's earliest gold coins while searching farmland in Devon on his first metal detecting search in over a decade. The find happened last September, and at first the man was oblivious to how rare the coin was. I'm not sure this is the coin, but it's certainly how the coin looks. It's thought to be one of only eight that are in existence. The coin is going to be auctioned and could sell, nobody really knows until it happens, for as much as £500,000. Let's turn to the Professor of Medieval History at King's College London, Dr. David Carpenter, who's been talking about this. Dr. Carpenter, appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. How rare?
It is very rare. That was indeed the coin you just saw. I mean, why is it so rare? It's because until then, all coins were simply silver pennies. I've actually got one here for you to see. This is the typical coin of the period, and there were millions of those minted. So that's the background. Then in 1257, Henry III thought, wonderful wheeze, we'll mint a gold coinage, and it was a complete flop. And that's why only 8 of them survive. And until this find, there were just 7. Now there's the 8. I wanted to have one of these all my life, but I haven't got £500,000, unfortunately, to join the bidding.
It's a reminder, actually, that some of the problems of economics don't really go away. Here we are looking back into the Middle Ages, and we talk a lot now about quantitative easing. This was its version at the time, albeit to deal with the Welsh Wars.
Well, it wasn't quite that. What Henry III did was that he wanted to take an army out to Sicily to put his second son on the throne of Sicily. And the currency in Sicily was indeed in gold. So Henry thought, well, I'll save up a gold treasure and take it out to Sicily. But then you're right, he ran into financial difficulties and decided he'd have to spend the treasure in England, and in particular, because he was involved in a war in Wales. And so he then minted the treasure into these gold coins. But what I think he hoped was that ever so many people would want to change their own stores of gold into his gold coins, and then the currency would take off and he could make a lot of money. The trouble was nobody wanted to change their gold into his coinage, and so the whole thing was a complete flop. He was told at his own exchequer by the citizens of London that the coin was useless. I'm afraid it was a typical folly of King Henry III. Who was very nice.
I was trying to find, it may have been your words in the newspapers, actually, Doctor, that told me this, that the coin was only worth the equivalent of a fortnight's wages for a farm labourer, which for a gold coin, and presumably, gold coin of some intrinsic value by dint of being gold, doesn't strike me as a lot of money.
No, I mean, it was basically worth 20 of these silver pennies, and one of those silver pennies could basically buy you food and drink for a day. But then if you think how very, very poor a large numbers of people were, I mean, 20 to have a stock even of 20 of these or one gold coin was quite a lot of money. And that's one reason why it wasn't much use. It was just no use to the large proportion of the population. I mean, the other reason was that there just was no very much gold circulating in the kingdom, and so nobody really wanted to have a gold coinage. 100 years later, when Edward III minted a successful gold coinage, the kingdom was awash with foreign gold. It wasn't awash with foreign gold in the mid-13th century, so the whole scheme was misconceived. Henry III was a very nice king and very pious, but he wasn't very wise.
I can think of some modern parallels, but now's not the time. David Carpenter, thanks very much indeed. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
Lots more coming up on today's show. After the break, we'll be talking to our reporter to give us the latest on the Marnie Clayton case. But first, the weather.
Hello again. Not much rain around recently, but most of us will see at least a little bit, either tonight or tomorrow, as a band of wet weather pushes south. Brighter skies will follow, but so will a fairly chilly breeze. The breeze has been fairly light recently thanks to high pressure, but weather fronts are now starting to edge in. This one's brought some wet conditions to Northern Ireland earlier and now spreading rain steadily across western Scotland. That rain could just trickle down into the far north of England for a time through this evening, and then more wet weather will arrive across Scotland and later in the night Northern Ireland. Much of the south, though, dry, but fog is likely to thicken up again this evening. Could be quite dense in places too, tending to lift through the night as the breeze picks up, and temperatures not quite as low as recent nights. Pockets of frost in rural areas across the south, but most towns and cities staying above freezing. Quite a cloudy start, though, tomorrow to northern England and Wales, with some rain here, and that rain trickles southwards. Could be heavy for a time across the southwest of England, but East Anglia and the southeast, just some light rain mostly through the afternoon. But it does clear, brighter skies follow, so do some wintry showers in the far northeast, and that cold wind picking up as well. So although temperatures around average, it will feel colder as that wind strengthens and brings more sleet and snow showers across the northeast during Wednesday evening. Could be quite icy here. A mixture of rain and sleet showers down the eastern side of England as well. Well scattered, but as I say, a little bit of snow is possible. And again, it could be icy here as we see the temperatures tumbling into Wednesday night and Thursday morning. So a frosty start for quite a few of us on Thursday, but bar the odd shower across the far southwest, Pembrokeshire, and one or two grazing the eastern side of England, the vast majority on Thursday. Set fair, a sparkling day of winter sunshine, but it will be on the chilly side. Things stay pretty dry into the weekends, but certainly in the south staying cold as well. Some sunny spells, but also fog and frost.
Join me, Isabel Oakeshott, every Friday at noon for my show, The Briefing. We go beyond the headlines, exploring the most important political stories from different angles.
all part of a broader question.
From exclusive interviews with top politicians
The United Kingdom is made up of people who are resilient.
You just can't take these things personally, right?
to celebrities and experts, we find out what makes the country tick. Every Friday at noon on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
You're with Colin Brazier on GB News on TV and on radio. Before we skip to our next story, let me just give you that daily COVID data. It comes in around about this time most days. I have a feeling this might be the last time we share it with you because the downward trajectory is really quite marked now on Omicron. So, for instance, today, as of 9 o'clock this morning, UK figures, we are below six figures for new cases now, 94,432. So that downward trend in the number of new cases really quite pronounced. Still, there's a lagging factor, which is a brutal way of describing the number of deaths from COVID after 28 days, 438 across the UK. Key thing, as we've been saying all along, is the number of hospitalisations. Don't have UK figures, but there's a story to be told just from Scotland's figures, where hospitalisation numbers fell. Number of people in hospital with COVID fell in Scotland by 21, 1,546 people in hospital with COVID, but only 59 are in intensive care. I have a feeling that might be the last day we do those daily COVID figures with Omicron. As I say, the trajectory seems pretty bedded in now. May change, but that's our current thinking. Officers from Hampshire Police have arrested a 21-year-old man in Basingstoke after missing Marnie Clayton was found safe. Marnie Clayton is 18, reported missing in the early hours of Sunday morning following a night out at a nightclub. She is now back at home with her family in Bracknell. The suspect remains in police custody. Let's cross to our reporter, Alice Porter, who is in Windsor. Alice, what do you know?
Hi there, good afternoon. Yeah, Saturday night began just a normal night for Marnie Clayton, as you say, 18 years old. She was out with friends here on William Street, which is a very sort of popular street to go out in Windsor, and she went to the Attic nightclub that is just behind me. She left there at 2 o'clock in the morning, but she never made it home. And just before 3 o'clock in the morning on Sunday morning, her family rang the police and said she was missing and said that this was totally out of character. Now, Thames Valley Police, they conducted quite an extensive investigation trying to find her. Many members of the public came forward with information, and her photo was widely shared on social media. The nightclub behind me, in fact, they actually sent over their CCTV footage in the hope that they would find her and track her down. And the good news is she was found safe and well yesterday afternoon in Basingstoke, which is about 30 miles from here in Windsor, but she doesn't live there. She lives in Bracknell, so there's many questions really that need to be asked about what happened within that 48-hour period. A 21-year-old man from Reading has been arrested in connection with her disappearance, and he's been held. There are 5 offences that he has been arrested on suspicion of, and they're quite serious. They're battery, assault actioning actual bodily harm, breach of police bail, making threats to kill, and I think most significant of all is false imprisonment. So that's a 21-year-old man from Reading who's been arrested on suspicion of those 5 offences, and he is currently in police custody. The good news is that Marnie Clayton is back with her family and well, but of course this case raises some very serious questions about women's safety. I mean, how an 18-year-old girl can go missing for almost 48 hours. It's good news that she's safe and well, but clearly there's some real concerns about what happened within that 48-hour window.
Alice Porter for now. Thanks very much indeed, Alice. Coming up after the break, we're going to be talking about Prince Harry. Again, some of you may groan. What's he done? Well, you'll remember from yesterday, he plans to sue the UK, the Home Office specifically, on the point of police protection. Subject of our debate today, should our police provide his security? Should you, the taxpayer, ultimately pony up for the cash required to pay for them? Stay tuned for both sides of that particular argument. But first, let's bring you up to date with the latest news headlines.
It's 4:30. Your top stories this hour. Boris Johnson has denied lying to Parliament, insisting he believed a gathering in Number 10's garden during lockdown was a work event. During a visit to a North London hospital, the Prime Minister said, "I am deeply sorry for misjudgments that were made." His former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, says he's prepared to swear under oath that the Prime Minister lied to MPs when he said he didn't know beforehand about the garden party in May 2020. The British gunman who took 4 people hostage at a synagogue in Texas was known to MI5. Malik Faisal Akram from Blackburn in Lancashire was investigated in 2020 and was assessed to be no longer a threat at the time he travelled to the United States. He was shot and killed after a 10-hour standoff with police and SWAT officers. No one else was injured. Police investigating the death of Ashleen Murphy have arrested a man in his 30s on suspicion of murder. Huge crowds gathered today for the funeral of the primary school teacher in County Offaly in Ireland. Her pupils lined the streets holding instruments and photos. Irish Taoiseach Micheál Martin and President Michael D. Higgins were both in attendance. The 23-year-old was killed while running along the Grand Canal in Tullamore. And COVID restrictions in Scotland introduced on Boxing Day will be lifted next week. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announced that from Monday, nightclubs can reopen and there'll be no limits on the number of people who can go to indoor events. Social distancing rules will be scrapped and there'll be no requirement of table service in restaurants. Ms Sturgeon warned people should remain cautious, however, keeping gatherings as small as possible and taking lateral flow tests before meeting up. Well, TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now let's get back to Brazier.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Dan Wootton, join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
You're with Colin Brazier on GB News, on TV and on radio. Now, Prince Harry, about whom we spent a lot of time talking, let us know if you think too much, he is taking legal action against the Home Office for its apparent refusal to allow him to pay for police protection whilst in the UK. The Duke of Sussex lost his state-funded police protection in 2020, at that point stepping back from royal duties, whereupon many of you will say, doesn't need police protection anymore, does it? He can provide his own. Well, his legal team is arguing that his American private security does not have adequate jurisdiction abroad and that he needs British police security whilst in the UK to protect not just him, but his growing family too. Let's ponder on this. We'll do so in the company of the royal commentator Rafe Handel-Menkou and the author Amy Nickel. A very warm welcome to both of you. Amy, can I start with you? Because I think you take a more sympathetic view towards the Duke of Sussex on this one. You feel that he faces a genuine threat in this country. All members of the royal family do. We've seen that in the past, obviously. But you feel perhaps there's a particular type of animus directed towards him. He may not be entirely safe.
So I really want to make clear before we start this debate that Prince Harry is not asking for the taxpayer to fund anything. He's saying that he wants to pay for his own security, but that he wants the Scotland Yard security, which is the only way he will feel safe in the UK. And I think that's for a number of reasons, because I think the way people are looking at it at the moment is that we risk history repeating itself. His mother, Princess Diana, died in tragic circumstances when he was 13. He's had a lot of trauma from that, so it's no surprise that he's particularly cautious. At the time of her death, she did not have state-funded security, much like he doesn't at the moment. And the reason this is important is because if you don't have the Scotland Yard security, they don't have access to the same intelligence. They also, really, really crucially, cannot carry a firearm. And ironically, this was sparked by when he came over to the UK for the unveiling of Diana's statue. And he was absolutely hounded by the paparazzi. He had a terrible experience, which has prompted him to say he doesn't want to come back to the UK unless he has the Scotland Yard protection, which he is saying he will pay for himself. So it's really a no-brainer, and I can't see how anybody could argue otherwise.
Rafe, just on Amy's point about the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, I mean, she's linking it directly, and some people would agree with her, to the behaviour of the paparazzi, and that's now mirrored more recently by the sorts of photojournalists who are following Prince Harry around. But just on a point of fact, I mean, I would say, and I've talked to Trevor Rees-Jones, who was the only survivor from that Paris crash in the Pont d'Almar tunnel back in 1997, and it happened because Henri Paul, the driver, was off his head on drink and drugs. Let's just be clear about that.
Yeah, exactly. And anybody who knows about these sorts of things, people in the security services and so forth, say it wasn't the paparazzi who drove Diana to her death. It was Henri Paul, and it was Dodi Fayed's inadequate security detail. So the blame actually does lie squarely on the security that the Fayeds had and on the chauffeur driver. Quite frankly, Prince Harry has to accept that we live in a free country. The paparazzi are a real nuisance. They're annoying. They can be a nightmare. But we live in a country with a free press. And quite frankly, being mobbed by paparazzi at Kew Gardens or on Kensington Church Street isn't really sufficient grounds to say that your life is in threat or a danger. That's a gross exaggeration. It's also completely inaccurate for him to say that by not having access to intelligence, he's somehow more at risk than anybody else. If there were a real security risk for Prince Harry, our intelligence services would, of course, take action. We have to remember that. They aren't going to simply let that information not go unnoticed. And then, of course, you could perfectly well expect Scotland Yard to take the necessary action. But what he needs to do, really, the solution to this, is to do exactly what his cousins, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, do. They hire ex-royal protection officers who are extremely skilled and have a lot of history in this area. And they've also got security clearance in the royal palaces. The only thing that they don't have is a firearm, which is quite understandable. And if Prince Harry speaks very nicely to Beatrice and Eugenie, maybe he can borrow their protection officers when he's in the country. And of course, we're only talking about occasions when he's not in royal surroundings, because if Harry's over here visiting his family, he will, of course, get the same protection that they're getting by virtue of being in the same area.
Amy, that also... go on. Amy, go on.
He will not be getting the same protection, because who was in his immediate family? Prince William, Prince Charles, and then his grandmother, the Queen, all who get state-funded security. When you try and compare him to his cousins, that's wholly incomparable, as if they get the same amount of attention or threat. He's sixth in line to the throne. There are only 5 people ahead of him. And also, you said it yourself, that Diana had inadequate security detail. The night has been that's completely wrong. The night has been quoted as absolute chaos from a security perspective. And there are a number of royal sources and security experts who have said that Diana might be alive today had Scotland Yard been protecting her. So I think what you said there was completely inaccurate.
Rafe, do you want to come back?
Yeah, absolutely. My point was, if Prince Harry is visiting his family in their royal palaces, he will benefit from their royal protection. The Princess Royal, Princess Anne, was almost kidnapped in 1974. Her personal protection officer was shot 3 times. She's the daughter of the Queen. She's just as high profile, and yet she doesn't get full-time police protection herself. So we've got to put this thing into perspective. He's a wealthy man. He can easily hire former royal protection officers. Scotland Yard are not Securicor. They're not guns for hire that you can just come over and hire them as if you're in a saloon somewhere. Where does this stop? Why he is a private citizen. Why not have Kanye West then come over and say he can hire them? Or indeed some foreign royal, despotic family from Saudi Arabia. What's to stop them coming over and making the same demands? It just doesn't hold any water.
Can I just add one thing to that? Kanye West is not immutably, he was not born into being a pop star. He chose his route. Prince Harry was born into his role. He has no say in whether he's a prince or not. It's by birth. Completely different.
Can I get involved in this? I'm sitting here like a lemon. I want to get involved because you're having such fun. Amy, just one tick. Just on the point about the private citizen thing. I mean, one choice the Duke of Sussex is exercising in all this is the decision to mount legal action against the Home Office. And for some people, that will strike a raw nerve, a sour note, because it's striking an antagonistic pose, isn't it? It will feel wrong to some people that the Prince of the United Kingdom, a Prince of the United Kingdom, grandson to our monarch and head of state, is suing a taxpayer-funded institution like the Home Office. They will look at this and say, come on, this is a family dispute. Sort it out amid the family.
I completely disagree, because I completely disagree. The reason he's doing this is for his family, not only his immediate family, his 2 young children, but also so that he can come back to the UK and visit his grandmother, who I think at the moment could do with a bit of company, the time that she's having. And I think he's making a stand because he's saying, what option have I got left? Like, I have said to you that I don't want your money. I just want your security that you provide. It's impossible for him to do it either way for reason that we've already said, particularly because, you can't have the same firearms, you can't have the same intelligence. So what is he left with? I think he's doing the reasonable thing for his family and for his extended family so that he can come and support his grandmother at the time that she most needs him.
He's grandstanding and he's exaggerating. If he wants police protection, he knows what he has to do. He has to return to the UK. He has to apologise for his terrible behaviour in recent years. He has to commit himself to perform royal duties 100%, help his family and serve the nation. You don't get something for nothing. If he wants the protection, You've got to do the graft. And quite
Something for
frankly,
nothing.
it's absolutely appalling in this Platinum Jubilee year for Prince Harry, who's already caused so much stress and trouble for his grandmother, to actually take his grandmother's government to court. We have to remember, it's the first time that a member of the royal family has taken Her Majesty's government to court. This is absolutely outrageous in a year when all focus should be on Her Majesty's 70 years of reigning as Queen. We've got enough to deal with Prince Andrew, also with Prince Harry's memoirs coming out this year. What a ghastly gift to give to your grandmother in her Jubilee year than a tell-all memoir, which is going to reveal all sorts of secrets, allegedly. Absolutely appalling behaviour, and there's no reason why he needs to do all of this right now. Terrible timing, terrible
There's
judgment.
also no reason why we all need to be discussing it right now, and I think you need
Well,
to
you didn't have to agree to come on, Amy.
But, you know, I think if you're talking about the Queen having a terrible time with certain members of her family, there are other ones that are particularly cause for concern, and I'm sure Harry's not really being the problem that you suggest in light of what else is going on in her family.
Amy, just,
sure,
I mean, sorry, go on, Rafe, have the last word.
No, absolutely. No one is saying that there aren't other royals who have caused problems this year, but Harry and Meghan certainly have been number 2, I would say, on the hit list of troubled royals this year. And it's just absolutely unacceptable for him to be behaving this way in this Jubilee year when his grandmother has lost her husband, has had severe problems with her own health, we know, and has had all of these other troubles at this time to deal with, when all attention should be focused on his grandmother becoming Queen on February the 6th. We're only about 3 weeks away from this grand event, and this story is now arising now. Terrible.
Rafe Hadel-Mancu. Sorry, Amy, but we're out of time. But next time, if you agree to come on, we'll talk about it. Rafe Hadel-Mancu and the author Amy Nicol joining us on that one. Keep your thoughts coming in. I'm sure you will. And on this one too, the national anthem returned to television screens this morning and on radio too, as GB News played God Save the Queen, suitably enough before the breakfast show. We are now the only TV news broadcaster to play the anthem after the BBC stopped doing so over 20 years ago. The edition marks the Queen's Platinum Jubilee year, as Rafe Hadel-Mancu was just saying there, and has been received fairly warmly by a great many of our viewers. Let's turn to Peter Whittle, who suggested we take this move on the channel when he was here on January the 8th. Peter, it's nice to be proved right, isn't it?
Colin, yes, I think it is. If I had sort of any possible effect on that decision, I'm very, very pleased because, you know, frankly, we need at this particular time, not just in the Jubilee year, but also with our general culture and our history under attack, we need to have these emblematic things on display. That includes the national anthem. And the fact is, I think it's brilliant that GB News have actually taken the initiative, and indeed that they've actually chosen a very beautiful arrangement of it. I mean, I think it looks great. There are nice pictures with it. It's not pompous. It's uplifting. I mean, we need to be, I think you'd agree, uplifted, actually. And I think it's a great thing. I'm very pleased to see it.
I'd agree on one other point, Peter, and that is about the need to coalesce around these emblems, these symbols, these anthems, and to get rid of this idea that whether it's a flag or whether it's a national anthem, somehow it's there to encourage jingoism. It's not. And we've, you know, these symbols matter. If you are trying to create a cohesive society, that ability to suspend your sense of irony even, you know, it's not the greatest anthem in the world. I'd be the first to admit that. I was a great fan of the theme for Britain, which the BBC used to play, which was sort of a medley from around the different parts of the United Kingdom, the Men of Harlech and Danny Boy and that sort of thing. But it is what it is. It's the national anthem. It's the best thing we've got, and we need to celebrate it.
I'd agree with that, Colin, but I mean, I don't agree with you about it being a dirge. I mean, a lot of people are very tough on our national anthem. I think it's actually quite a grand one, so long as it's done the proper way, and so long as it's arranged the proper way. I mean, but in a way, I mean, you know, you just said there's a particular tune you like. I like Jerusalem, for example. I mean, I like this, but it's sort of not the point. The point is it is our national anthem, and the sort of people who want to kind of get rid of it, or in this case, we're talking about the BBC not doing it. You know, we know, Colin, surely that, you know, the majority of people who are working at the BBC, it would really stick in the craw for them to actually put the national anthem on now, even if it was the most beautiful tune and they all liked it. It's because of what it represents. And I think something I've always thought is that when you have all of our institutions, whether it's BBC or the academic world or the police, whatever, you know, basically being captured, I think that we've got to stop saying, look, please, BBC, do the national anthem again. It's not going to happen. We have to do it ourselves. So that's where I think GBNews, of all people, you know, should be doing it. And indeed, I'm thrilled that they are, particularly in this year.
Peter, it's a straw in the wind, and you hope somebody catches that straw in other parts of our country. I'm thinking in particular of within the educational sector. I know people get tired of that analogy with America and people, you know, kids standing up before the beginning of each school day in America and doing the national anthem, and there'll be people online saying the thing is, even suggesting such a thing. But is it such a bad idea?
Of course, it's a great idea, Colin. I mean, most people would agree with you. I've been saying this for years, indeed, have put this forward as an idea. Why should every school not start with the national anthem, have a picture of the Queen, have the Union flag, just like they do in America? You know, the chances of it happening are remote, and for the reasons you've just said, and that is that we have a very left-wing teaching establishment now who would fight tooth and nail not to do that. But if there ever was a good time to start that, it is right now on the 70th anniversary of the Queen's succession.
Amen to that, Peter. Really good to talk to you. Thanks for your time. Peter.
Thank you, Colin. Take care.
And you. Coming up, former head of UK Border Force talks to me about how to end, in his view, the Channel crisis. But first, it's time for the weather.
Hello again. Not much rain around recently, but most of us will see at least a little bit either tonight or tomorrow as a band of wet weather pushes south. Brighter skies will follow, but so will a fairly chilly breeze. The breeze has been fairly light recently thanks to high pressure, but weather fronts are now starting to edge in. This one's brought some wet conditions to Northern Ireland earlier and now spreading rain steadily across western Scotland. That rain could just trickle down into the far north of England for a time through this evening, and then more wet weather will arrive across Scotland and later in the night Northern Ireland. Much of the south, though, dry, but fog is likely to thicken up again this evening. Could be quite dense in places too, tending to lift through the night as the breeze picks up. And temperatures not quite as low as recent nights. Pockets of frost in rural areas across the south, but most towns and cities staying above freezing. Quite a cloudy start, though, tomorrow to northern England and Wales, with some rain here, and that rain trickles southwards. Could be heavy for a time across the southwest of England, but East Anglia and the southeast, just some light rain mostly through the afternoon. But it does clear, brighter skies follow, so do some wintry showers in the far northeast, and that cold wind picking up as well. So although temperatures around average, it will feel colder as that wind strengthens and brings more sleet and snow showers across the northeast during Wednesday evening. Could be quite icy here. A mixture of rain and sleet showers down the eastern side of England as well. Well scattered, but as I say, a little bit of snow is possible. And again, it could be icy here as we see the temperatures tumbling into Wednesday night and Thursday morning. So a frosty start for quite a few of us on Thursday, but bar the odd shower across the far southwest, Pembrokeshire, and one or two grazing the eastern side of England, the vast majority on Thursday. Set fair, a sparkling day of winter sunshine, but it will be on the chilly side. Things stay pretty dry into the weekends, but certainly in the south staying cold as well. Some sunny spells, but also fog and frost.
Join me, Nana Akua, on Fridays, Saturdays and Sunday afternoons here on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as my panel and I take on some of the top stories hitting the headlines.
You can look up the statistics.
No, you look it up. I hug everyone. We learn from it and try and move on. That's it. Opinion is at the heart of the show. It's a place for open and frank conversation, but without the fear of cancellation. So join me here on GB News on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons between 4 and 6 p.m.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview Channel 236.
On Sky, we're Channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Government still makes or faces some big decisions, regardless of which part of the UK you're in, when it comes to COVID regulations. But the direction of travel now is getting clearer each and every day. And I say that in the context of the figures I'm about to share with you, which clearly indicate that Omicron, I think it's fair to say, is pretty much on the run, still doing damage, but the direction of travel is really quite promising. This might be the final day we go through the daily COVID figures with you, because increasingly they don't tell us a story, they just repeat yesterday's story. So in that light, I'll give you this data. As of 9 o'clock this morning, new cases, we're below six figures now for new cases across the UK as a whole. The figure 94,432. Fatalities, 28 days of death. A lagging indicator, sorry to put it quite so euphemistically, 438 deaths across the UK. As we've said all along, hospitalisations for many people are the key metric. Omicron very transmissible, not particularly lethal. And it's interesting to bring you those hospitalisation figures. We don't have them for the UK as a whole, we have them for Scotland, where the number of people in Scotland with COVID in hospital, 1,546. That's down 21 on the day, with only 59 people in intensive care with COVID-related symptoms. So there's really some pretty encouraging news there. Nobody's going to call it and say that's the end of it, but you can see why there's a lot to cheer on there. Let's talk to Dr. Okorocha, who's our regular contributor here, one of those doctors who's agreed to come and talk regularly about COVID and other matters. Amika, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. What do you make of the latest figures we have here? And in particular, the fact we're down to below six figures when it comes to new cases?
You know what, Colin, it's an interesting one, because on one side, I'm really happy that I'm seeing the figures come down in terms of new cases, hospitalization, admissions. But on the other side, I'm very aware that not all the time do the figures actually reflect exactly what we're seeing in A&E. As an A&E doctor, I've been sometimes working my butt off, seeing so many people coming in and then seeing figures drop on TV. And then that's how we kind of knew that sometimes there is this kind of lag that happens, especially after the weekend, where figures aren't quite up to date and not exactly reflective. I think the best thing to do is actually study the figures over time and see over days and days and weeks, and then we can see a steady trend. I think that's going to be more reflective than just kind of taking a spot figures, that the numbers are dropping. But it is a positive sign, so hopefully we'll see them drop even further.
And with that positive sign, Doctor, comes that, I imagine, the opportunity for you and your colleagues to say, let's set about some serious waiting lists.
Sorry, say that one more time, please.
Well, just the fact that if we've got it on the run, Omicron, then we can really set about the testing and pressing business of solving some of those backlogs, whether it's in oncology, whether it's in any kind of elective surgery, all the waiting lists that we've seen grow and grow.
Yeah, it's true. We've had backlogs from the beginning of the pandemic, and I know because a lot of it comes down to sheer numbers of manpower. As you know, anytime an NHS worker tests positive for COVID, they have to go off and they have to isolate. And regardless of the symptoms now, I know we're doing a lot with the isolation period. However, it's still workforce management. And myself, being one of the NHS workers, I see that when it comes to work resource management, it can be difficult when your colleagues have gone off sick and you're two people manning what should be a 4-person shift. And that means that people like me can stay in our regular jobs, such as A&E, rather than having to be redeployed onto COVID wards. What we felt in the first wave, which was very difficult, is a number of us who did kind of elective jobs, such as working in outpatients and attacking waiting lists, had to go to the more priority serious measures, such as working on coronavirus wards. But as we see less patients coming in with coronavirus, we know that we can be delegated to our regular jobs and hopefully tackle all the people who are waiting for elective procedures and on the waiting list for their appointments.
Yeah, well, we hope so, don't we? Doctor, thanks very much, as ever, for your time. Thanks a lot. And your time has been devoted towards filling in some of our poll details today. It's ahead of an interview we're going to be doing in the next hour. This is the subject. If you agree with the scientist who says young women are storing up trouble for the future by avoiding a meat diet. We can't show you the graphic. You'll pull it up on our website if you can access that. Some interesting emails in response to it. Just very briefly, a flavour. Steve says meat animal products are essential for good health, needing to take supplements to fill gaps in diet, says it all. B12 in a bioavailable form only exists in animal products. However, Lewis says, as opposed to the meat-eating women who are battling colon cancer, heart disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol and diabetes, which he says is where meat takes you. Let us know where you think our priorities ought to lie when it comes to eating meat. As I say, we've got a doctor coming in the next hour who's making the case that we do really need to keep eating it to ensure, particularly for young women, that they have all the minerals, etc. they need. Well, hi there. Welcome to Brazier. Coming up live at 5. Terror attack in Texas. Why some people want to blame anybody but the perpetrator for the attack on an American synagogue. Also, the former boss of Border Force tells us why the number of cross-channel migrants may well breach the 60,000 mark this year, at least. And as we were just saying, the case for eating meat, why a leading scientist says veganism is storing up trouble for the future. But first, the headlines with Miranda.
Good afternoon, it's 5 o'clock. Your top stories. Boris Johnson has denied lying to Parliament, insisting he believed a gathering in Number 10's garden during lockdown was a work event. His former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, says he's prepared to swear under oath that the Prime Minister lied to MPs when he said he didn't know beforehand about the garden party in May 2020. During a visit to a North London hospital, the Prime Minister said he regrets the drinks events held in Number 10.
I want to begin by repeating my apologies to everybody for the misjudgments that I've made, that we may have made in Number 10 and beyond, whether in Downing Street or throughout the pandemic. Categorically, that nobody told me and nobody said that this was something that was against the rules, that was a breach of the COVID rules, or we were doing something that wasn't a work event.
The COVID restrictions introduced in Scotland to reduce the spread of the Omicron variant will be lifted next week. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announced that from Monday, nightclubs can reopen and there'll be no limits on the number of people who can go to indoor events. Social distancing rules will be scrapped and there'll be no requirement of table service in restaurants. Ms Sturgeon warned people should remain cautious, though, keeping gatherings as small as possible and taking lateral flow tests before meeting up.
A combination of booster vaccinations, the willingness of the public to adapt their behaviour to help stem transmission and the temporary protective measures introduced in December has helped blunt the impact of the Omicron wave. The rise in cases driven by Omicron peaked in the first week of January, and that we are now on the downward slope of this wave of cases.
Police investigating the death of Ashleen Murphy have arrested a man in his 30s on suspicion of murder. Earlier this afternoon, huge crowds gathered for the funeral of the primary school teacher in County Offaly in Ireland. Her pupils lined the streets holding instruments and photos. Irish Taoiseach Micheál Martin and President Michael D. Higgins were both in attendance. The 23-year-old was killed while running along the Grand Canal in Tullamore. A British gunman who took 4 hostages at a Texas synagogue was previously investigated by MI5. Malik Faisal Akram from Blackburn in Lancashire was investigated in 2020 and was assessed to be no longer a threat at the time he travelled to the United States. He was shot and killed after a 10-hour standoff with police and SWAT officers. No one else was injured. 3 adults and 2 children have been arrested in connection with a stabbing in York. They were 2 women aged 40 and 18, a man aged 40 and 2 children aged 15 and 12, all from York. Police say the violent incident happened on Saturday afternoon. A 44-year-old man was injured and taken to hospital by ambulance. Officers say all 5 who were arrested have been released on bail and inquiries are ongoing. Downing Street is considering whether to bring back plans to clamp down on noisy protests. It follows a string of defeats for the government in the House of Lords last night over its police, crime and sentencing and courts bill. Peers backed a Labour amendment scrapping the power to impose conditions on marches judged to be too loud. The bill now returns to the Commons for further debate. Baroness Claire Fox told GB News the right to protest should be legally protected.
The government asked the Lords to start deciding law by bringing them in, trying to sneak them in through the Lords in November. You basically got ministers standing up saying, well, we will allow you to do that if you behave. And you do think, I'm sorry, it's our right to protest that's legal. You have to now justify when you make it illegal. And they didn't justify it. That's the reality. And they, as a consequence, were humiliated.
The Royal Navy will not push back migrant boats attempting to cross the Channel. That's according to the Defence Minister. James Heappey told Parliament the Ministry of Defence will take over command of operations from Border Force by the end of the month. But they will not be using controversial sonic weapons or turning boats back to France. And British #1 star Emma Raducanu has won her first-round Australian Open match in 3 sets. The 19-year-old tennis star beat America's Sloane Stephens. She fought back from losing the second set, 6-2, to win the third. Well, this is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Back now to Brazier.
Hi there, giving the news a twist on this episode of Brazier. The French presidential hopeful who's been charged with inciting racial hatred after calling migrants rapists and murderers. Big Brother Watch joined me to explain why it's fine to bash Insulate Britain, but they shouldn't be used as an excuse to stop lawful protests. And why is nobody interested in the daily COVID figures anymore? Is it because they've stopped really mattering? Well, the Daily Telegraph is reporting that Priti Patel has been warned that the number of illegal migrants crossing the Channel could well double at least this year. Last year, at least 28,000, we don't really know, 28,300 migrants made the crossing. But the Home Secretary has reportedly been told that number will rise sharply. Tony Smith, the former Director General of Border Force, told the Telegraph that the projected figure of more than 60,000 migrants was not unreasonable. And he joins me now, as you see. Tony Smith, a very warm welcome to you. On the Royal Navy being put in overall charge of this, if you were at the Border Force amongst your erstwhile colleagues, what do you think their reaction to that news would have been? Would it have been along the lines of, well, good luck to them?
I don't think so. I think it's helpful that we have got help. And certainly in my time, I'm not ashamed to say that when I was in charge of the Border Force, I didn't ask for help from my friends. The military have huge assets. As you know, we should be very proud of our MOD assets. And if they were to offer an olive branch to me to say, hey, Tony, you've got a real problem on the English Channel, would you like some help? Of course, I would say yes. I think there is a little bit of detail to be worked through yet, Colin. I don't think we've got through to the bottom of this because there will be discussions, I am sure now, going on across Whitehall as we speak about who exactly is going to do what. But I think a broader range of assets to deal with this. But as you know, this problem is causing huge public concern. And I think the Home Office is right to ask for help across Whitehall to try and allay public concerns about it. And I don't think, bringing in the military will necessarily stop the boats, which is I think what most people want, but it would certainly be an asset, I think. So that would be my position.
Do you think it's, I was going to say, might it actually encourage more people to cross if they know there are more boats awaiting them in the, mid-channel, more hands to bear them into a boat and then on to the UK? Do feel free to answer that question, but I'm trying to get a sense from your tone, Tony, whether you think this is just window dressing by the government. It seems to a lot of people, sometimes you want to look like you're really gripping a problem, whether it's not enough jabs for COVID or there's flooding going on, call in the army. It looks like you're really taking a problem seriously.
No, I don't think that, Colin. I think this is a very, very serious problem. It's hugely, hugely difficult. The reason it's so difficult is because we have not been able to secure the agreement of France to do what the French ought to be doing, which is to work with us on stopping the boats. The French have taken some measures, as you know. We've paid them a good deal of money to take some measures on the beaches, but in my view, there is a lot more the French government could do if they were minded to. Certainly, I've seen absolutely no reason. I've been over there, Colin, and actually had a look for myself. There is no reason why these vessels could not very easily be punctured on the beach by officers safely and securely to stop women and children from getting in them and putting their lives at risk. Even if they're outnumbered, the police have significant resources, very powerful resources in that part of the world. You wouldn't really want to mess with them, I don't think. So I think the French have capabilities that they're not using. And of course, this ongoing problem of the maritime challenge, where once people are waterborne, people are being, allowed to drift towards UK waters where we have a duty to save lives, don't we? The problem with that, as you well know, is that of course they then claim asylum. It fuels a human smuggling model, and so the figures we're talking about now are not unreasonable, Colin. So if you put yourself in the shoes of the Home Secretary and the government, this is a really, really difficult challenge. And the challenge now is, what can we do unilaterally if we cannot get help from our friends across the water seriously, because they could stop this at a stroke? If we cannot get them to help, what are we going to do? How are we going to stop the boat?
Well,
I'm afraid
we've just got time to address that. I love the idea of French capabilities, by the way, just basically being a knife to puncture a dinghy. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? But with the will behind it, as you said, and that will's just not there. Ergo, what do we do? If there's a want of French cooperation, we've got to solve this problem ourselves. We look at what the Danish have done to talk about a third party, a third nation, perhaps someone like Rwanda. They've signed a memorandum of understanding. Does that fly at all for you, Tony, or is that just a way of Priti Patel saying that we've got a plan?
So the next news story, I hope, Colin, will be that the Home Office are asking help from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, because they're the ones that have they manage relations with other countries, don't they, in the EU or beyond now. And essentially, I would be saying to them, look, what agreements? We're signing trade deals, aren't we, all over the world? Is there a clause in there that says if someone comes to the UK illegally from your country, you'll take them back? Will you issue them with a passport? We are now in a realm of I'm afraid, migrants being used as political pawns. We see this on the Southern American border. We see it. You've covered it yourselves out on the Eastern European border. So that's why we need help to get agreements with other countries because if you really want to reduce the pull factor, you've got to stop access to the communities. That does mean, I'm afraid, some fairly harsh measures in terms of detaining people and removing them instantly from the territory, and then they won't keep coming. If we can't do that, Colin, I'm afraid they're going to continue to come, and that's going to cause more pain, more deaths, and fuel human smuggling, which is a dreadful thing, I think, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. And that is another debate we could have about where people sit on that one. I'm sure you will, but it's a hugely challenging environment. So I think it's the right thing we're looking at this. across government.
Well, I tell you what, Tony, you introduced an interesting idea by how we spend that £14 billion worth of foreign aid every year, whether there ought to be some strings attached, some conditionality attached to what it does. Tony Smith, former head of the Border Force, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. House of Lords last night rejected a series of proposed measures in the government's police, crime, sentencing and courts bill, proposals to give you a flavour, for example, that would punish people who lock themselves onto objects with up to 51 weeks imprisonment up to. The government's framed it as necessary to tackle the likes of Extinction Rebellion and insulate Britain, but the critics, and they're out there, call it a crackdown on civil liberties and the top of a potentially very slippery slope when it comes to civil liberties that we all enjoy. Is the government simply helping working people avoid disruption, or are they claiming more control over our right to legally assemble and to protest? Well, joining me now, Mark Johnson, the Legal and Policy Officer at Big Brother Watch. Mark, thanks so much for your time. We've got these amendments, haven't we? So that some of the checks and balances in the small hours of this morning from the revising chamber, from the House of Lords, thrown back to the Commons. There's a system that's sort of working there, to some degree at least.
That's right. Last night was a really big victory for civil liberties in this country, and it's been a very difficult few years in that regard. But this bill is the latest in a series of bills that is very authoritarian. It's really a protest crackdown bill, and it was a really good result for our rights and freedoms. As you mentioned,
Mark, you'll know. You don't need me to tell you, but I'll tell you anyway. I mean, you know, many of our viewers take an absolutely contrary view. They say to see a repeat of some of what we saw last year, particularly around Insulate Britain, but not just Insulate Britain, but ambulances being stopped from going about their business, ferrying sick people to hospital, people chaining themselves, gluing themselves to the road, all the rest of it. And part of the problem there is that we're looking at a picture now, apologies to our radio listeners, of a white van parked up. We saw so many standoffs between members of the public, who could have intervened, could have wrenched people away and torn off their skin from their hands that was glued to the ground. But they sign up to that unwritten contract between the governed and those who do the governing, which is that we contract out our policing to other people. But that was coming under real strain last year, it seems to a lot of people. So the government had to do something.
A lot of the behaviour that you're talking about there is largely covered by existing criminal offences. So, for example, obstructing a public highway is a criminal offence, obstructing an emergency services vehicle is a criminal offence. And what's not clear is that bringing in a raft of new measures that would actually have a big impact on the right to peaceful process, whether that would be necessary or proportionate. Some of the measures that you spoke about previously included, clamping down on peaceful protests where they're deemed to be too noisy, or making it more difficult to protest in Parliament Square. That's not necessary. That's not proportionate, and effectively, it's just
I know people.
On peaceful protest.
Sorry to interrupt. The point about noise is made a lot, isn't it? But I'm just looking at some of those amendments last night. Things like disrupting infrastructure. I mean, that could be an airport, but it could be a printing press for a newspaper. I mean, that was rejected by peers. We've got Lord Paddock last night, maybe the early hours of this morning, saying this government bill is reminiscent of Cold War Eastern Bloc police states. Come on.
What I would say, more than anything else, is that in trying to bring those measures in, some of the measures that you've spoken about there, about obstructing infrastructure, these were a set of amendments that the government tried to bring in right at the very end of the process. The bill had already been all the way through the House of Commons. It was most of the way through the House of Lords, and they tried to bring in around 10, 12 new amendments that would radically alter how policing and protest work in this country. And regardless of what you think of them, that's not an adequate way to make law. But by no means is that an adequate way to make law. But when you look at the provisions in more detail, they were drafted in an incredibly broad way. You mentioned something like locking on. I mean, that's drafted in a way that could actually criminalise people who are linking arms. So the measures deserve much more scrutiny than they were afforded. It was a cynical attempt to railroad these measures in last minute. And actually, the wider impact would be on people who were exercising their legitimate right to peaceful protest.
Mark Johnson from Big Brother Watch. Mark, appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Much more coming up on today's show after the break. Time for the Brazier angle, but first, we'll bring you the weather.
Hello again. Not much rain around recently, but most of us will see at least a little bit either tonight or tomorrow as a band of wet weather pushes south. Brighter skies will follow, but so will a fairly chilly breeze. The breeze has been fairly light recently thanks to high pressure, but weather fronts are now starting to edge in. This one's brought some wet conditions to Northern Ireland earlier and now spreading rain steadily across western Scotland. That rain could just trickle down into the far north of England for a time through this evening, and then more wet weather will arrive across Scotland and later in the night Northern Ireland. Much of the south though dry, but fog is likely to thicken up again this evening. Could be quite dense in places too, tending to lift through the night as the breeze picks up, and temperatures not quite as low as recent nights. Pockets of frost in rural areas across the south, but most towns and cities staying above freezing. Quite a cloudy start though tomorrow to northern England and Wales, with some rain here, and that rain trickles southwards. Could be heavy for a time across the southwest of England, but East Anglia and the southeast, just some light rain mostly through the afternoon. But it does clear, brighter skies follow, so do some wintry showers in the far northeast, and that cold wind picking up as well. So although temperatures around average, it will feel colder as that wind strengthens and brings more sleet and snow showers across the northeast during Wednesday evening. Could be quite icy here. A mixture of rain and sleet showers down the eastern side of England as well. Well scattered, but as I say, a little bit of snow is possible. And again, it could be icy here as we see the temperatures tumbling into Wednesday night and Thursday morning. So a frosty start for quite a few of us on Thursday, but bar the odd shower across the far southwest, Pembrokeshire, and one or two grazing the eastern side of England, the vast majority on Thursday. Set fair, a sparkling day of winter sunshine, but it will be on the chilly side. Things stay pretty dry into the weekends, but certainly in the south staying cold as well. Some sunny spells, but also fog and frost.
I'm Darren McCaffrey, and join me on The Briefing Monday to Thursday at 3 p.m. You'll get your afternoon fix of all the latest political stories, debate and analysis, as well as interviews with some of the biggest names in UK politics.
It's a problem that affects the whole world, Darren.
From Westminster to Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast, if it's happening in UK politics, we've got it covered. That's The Briefing with me, Darren McCaffrey, Monday to Thursday, 3 p.m. on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
You're at GB News on TV and on radio. It's now time for my daily opinion piece, the Brazier Angle. We start with a question. Do we make excuses for violent jihadists? Are we reluctant to attribute their actions to an ideology lest we be accused of Islamophobia? Let's consider the latest attempted atrocity. Malik Faisal Akram took hostages at gunpoint in a Texas synagogue and held them for 10 hours before being shot dead. Why did he have to be killed? Asked his brother back home in Blackburn in an interview with Sky News, as if the bloodshed was somehow a reflection of heavy-handed American police work, not the actions of a man so riddled with anti-Semitism he was willing to travel 8,000 miles in search of victims. But that was Akram's brother. We can understand why he might want to blame someone other than his sibling as he struggles with shock and sorrow. Less comprehensible is the reaction of those who are not grieving, who have never heard of Malik Faisal Akram before his name flashed up in news reports at the weekend. The commentators and journalists and community leaders who contract out culpability. The mainstream voices that deflect blame away from the perpetrator so that it can be heaped at the door of institutions or ideas the progressive mind finds more of a fit. What do I mean by that? I mean that when a terrorist like Akram strikes, it's easier to say he was brainwashed or suffering from a mental illness, or that he was on MI5's radar and they should have picked up signs of his radicalisation or stopped him flying to America, as if an act of terror is as predictable and preventable as a fire or flood. Well, it's not, is it? Malik is an uncomfortable reminder of how sometimes Islamism refuses to conform to our behavioural expectations. Malik wasn't a teenager, confused about life and his role in it. He wasn't an angry young man, a university dropout, spurned and lonely. He was 44 and a father. He'd lived a life. And yet he made a choice to travel to another continent in search of Jewish victims. He set out to terrorise, not on a whim, but according to a plan that took time to devise, research and execute. I don't say this lightly. I say it after more than 2 decades of reporting from behind the police tape used to cordon off the scenes of Islamist terror attacks, from Islamabad to Istanbul, from Nice to Nairobi, from the airport at Glasgow to the arena at Manchester. In the decade after 9/11, there was an open-minded spirit of robust inquiry that would, I think, now be defined by that most weaselly of weasel words, Islamophobia. There is nothing bigoted or racist about asking how a faith can become an ideology, how an ideology can sometimes become a manifesto for violent action. In the noughties, there was a willingness to take Islamism seriously as a belief system, as a political creed, and interrogate it. Does that happen now? I don't think it does. Partly that's because several of those involved, I'm thinking of someone like the radical preacher Anjem Chowdhury, who I interviewed several times, were subsequently sent to prison. But it's also because it was just too much trouble, too difficult for the media to consider the role played by an ideology that seeks to persuade, not by infiltrating mentally ill minds, but by persuading people with a set of coherent, if often abhorrent, beliefs. Many of my mainstream media colleagues, including some who stood with me behind the police tape of assorted atrocities, have their doubts about the rigid journalistic template which now governs coverage of terror attacks. Talk about balloons and cards and coming to terms with. Talk about mental health and brainwashing. Talk about how the security services failed to follow up leads. Talk about anything but the ideology, lest you be accused of Islamophobia. A meaningless word deliberately coined to chill debate. Why do I say that? Because while there is unquestionably such a thing as anti-Muslim bigotry, which should be vehemently rejected, there can be no such thing as Islamophobia. We cannot be phobic about a proselytizing belief system. Saying you can't criticize Islamism is like saying you can't impugn Marxism. Far too many journalists now fail to recognise, even less stand up for, that vital distinction. That's the Brazier angle. Let's turn to Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, welcome to you and thanks for your time. Do you think we often overlook the agency of the perpetrator when attacks like this happen and seek to blame others?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a common tactic, isn't it, to try and avoid going to the hard part of the question. And the hard part of the question is that there are people out there who want to kill and maim and injure and wound in the name of ideology. That's not something that most of us would understand. And so it's instinctive, isn't it? We try and find a more sensible explanation as far as we're concerned. Maybe it's mental illness, maybe it's, sort of they were forced out of desperation to do it. But it turns out that in a great many of these cases, it is ideological terrorism. It is a belief in something, in this case, radical Islam, that causes the terrorist to strike.
Do you recognise that arc, that historical arc I describe over the last 20 years? It's certainly my experience. I can't speak for others, but it's certainly my experience that it felt in the noughties, whether it was the 7/7 bombings or whether it was the immediate backwash from 9/11, we were really able to get into some of the ideological questions in a very candid and difficult and robust way. And I don't know when the changing point, when the change happened, whether it was clearly quite gradual, it wasn't an event necessarily, but it feels now there is a greater degree of prissiness about it, a greater degree of displacement and avoiding some of the tougher questions.
Well, I think to a point there was always that reluctance to get into some of this debate. Some of us could have the debate in an easy way, but there were many people who were willing, not to. I mean, you had constant declarations, did you not, at the time of various terrorist atrocities, when people said, "Oh, this is not real Islam. Islam's a religion of peace. This is nonsense." You then went through a slight change when people started to recognise the reality that there are varying forms of Islam, and that it's not for non-Muslims to determine what the authentic version of Islam is. And then finally, you come back to the effect today, which has sort of gone beyond what was originally the case, where people are, in a sense, scared sometimes to mention this because they're deemed to be racist in some way, Islamophobic, racist. It's a disaster to talk about these issues. Best to sweep it under the carpet because, as you well know, Colin, the cardinal sin in society in some people's eyes today is racism. And if they determine you are a racist for having spoken about something so obvious as this, then, you are guilty of that sin. So I don't, I'm not surprised that some people have, resiled from the conversation because they're worried about the chilling effect that this has had. But it is out there, and it is preventing, of course, an effective solution to the problems. If you can't recognise the problem in the first place, there's no way you can solve it.
What do you say to those people who say, I'm wrong, there is no distinction to be made between anti-Muslim bigotry, brackets which definitely exists and demonstrably exists, and Islamophobia, which I say as a neologism, it's a created concept that is deliberately and contrived to stop legitimate conversations about difficult and sensitive subjects. What do you say to those people who say those two things, there's no gap between those two things, Islamophobia is a kind of anti-Muslim bigotry?
Well, it isn't, because you've got two different issues here. As you've quite rightly mentioned, there is clearly hatred and racism towards Muslims. That exists, and that is very cleverly defined in the term anti-Muslim hatred. If you hate someone because they're a Muslim, if you hate someone for doing something because of some Islamic practice, then you've got a problem there in terms of anti-Muslim hatred. However, if you're questioning, if you like, the interpretations of Islam, if you're looking at the many sort of different interpretations, and you look at one version versus another, that is merely an examination of a religion. It is not a crime to do that. And I think one of the most important things people to realize is there is no authorized form of Islam. There are many different schools of Islam. There are many different sects in Islam. And as a result, it is perfectly possible to welcome 90% of Islam and forms of Islam, and to have a problem with the teachings of 10%, say. That is not anti-Muslim hatred. That is a legitimate examination of a religion and the teachings of a sect or a way that religion comes about. And that is an entirely different thing to hating someone on account of the blanket phrase that you are a Muslim.
Alan Mendoza, as ever, appreciate your analysis. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Still to come this afternoon, after the break, I'll be joined by the Shadow Cabinet Minister, Annalise Dodds, to discuss the cost of living. But first, let's bring the latest news headlines with Miranda. Thanks,
Colin. It's 5:32. Your top stories this hour. And Boris Johnson has denied lying to Parliament, insisting he believed a gathering in Number 10's garden during lockdown was a work event. During a visit to a North London hospital, the Prime Minister said, "I am deeply sorry for misjudgments that were made." His former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, says he's prepared to swear under oath that the Prime Minister lied to MPs when he said he didn't know beforehand about the garden party in May 2020. The British gunman who took 4 people hostage at a synagogue in Texas was known to MI5. Malik Faisal Akram from Blackburn in Lancashire was investigated in 2020 and was assessed to be no longer a threat at the time he travelled to the United States. He was shot and killed after a 10-hour standoff with police and SWAT officers. No one else was injured. Police investigating the death of Ashleen Murphy have arrested a man in his 30s on suspicion of murder. Huge crowds gathered today for the funeral of the primary school teacher in County Offaly in Ireland. Her pupils lined the streets holding instruments and photos. Irish Taoiseach Micheál Martin and President Michael D. Higgins were both in attendance. The 23-year-old was killed while running along the Grand Canal in Tullamore. And COVID restrictions in Scotland introduced on Boxing Day will be lifted next week. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announced that from Monday, nightclubs can reopen and there'll be no limits on the number of people who can go to indoor events. Social distancing rules will be scrapped and there will be no requirement of table service in restaurants. Ms Sturgeon warned people should remain cautious, though, keeping gatherings as small as possible and taking lateral flow tests before meeting up. Well, on TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. After the break, it's back to Brazier, and I'll have a full news roundup for you at the top of the hour.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm going to take you abroad briefly. The French presidential hopeful Eric Zemmour has been ordered to pay a €10,000 fine for, quote, inciting hatred and racial abuse. During an interview in September of 2020, the hard-right candidate made a series of comments about unaccompanied migrant children, of whom he said this, quote, they have nothing to do here. They are thieves, they are murderers, they are rapists. That's all they are. They must be sent back. And they must not even come. Well, Zemmour has already been prosecuted 15 times over the last decade for various speech-related offences, joining us now. Paris correspondent for The Telegraph, Anne-Elizabeth Moutet. Anne-Elizabeth, thanks so much for your time. Very much appreciated. He seems to have gone too far this time.
Well, yes and no, Colin, because he's already been accused by a different set of organisations a year ago for what he said. What you quoted is true, but not complete. He first said that those children were actually not minors. They were masquerading as minors. And he said some of them. But it still is sort of something violent. However, last time, he was condemned the first time, and then he appealed, and he won the appeal because this was not racial hatred. His barrister pleaded that the fact that he said these are people who masquerade as something, but no mention of ethnicity or of origin, meant that you could not call this racial hatred. He's appealing now, and it may very well be that again he will be the judgment will be overturned. We're watching this. Of course, it's very convenient for his opponent to get him sort of pigeonholed as a racist, and the person who's had most got to gain of this is Marine Le Pen, because the two of them are battling for the large, extensive vote of the French far right, and if he goes down, she goes up.
Is it that binary? Well, yeah. I mean, where is he in the polls, Anne-Elizabeth? I mean, he had that amazing. I was going to call it renaissance. It wasn't. He just emerged almost from nowhere, from 24-hour talk shows, 24-hour news talk shows, onto the scene, and astonished everybody with ratings that just seemed scarcely plausible. They fell back a little bit. Where are we now?
Oh, he's not doing that well right now. He's doing about 15.5%, whereas Marine Le Pen is doing 17.5 or 18, which is exactly the same thing as the Républicain candidate, the centre-right candidate from the same party as Nicolas Sarkozy and Jacques Chirac, Valérie Pécresse. It's still a very heated race, but certainly Éric Zemmour has lost momentum, and his enemies, I mean, he has enemies on the left who absolutely believe what they're saying, as opposed to Marine Le Pen, who's sort of thinking this is absolutely wonderful. She doesn't like him. She feels that he's taking his opportunity. But it's a very strange election. We've never seen this, a situation in which there is no left-wing candidate that has even a hope of being in the second round. The official candidate of the Socialist Party, Anne Hidalgo, the Paris mayor, now is polling 2.5%. This is the party of François Mitterrand and François Hollande. It's very, very strange. And of course, the candidate who still sort of has got about 25% voting intentions in the first round, that's when everybody competes, and then you've got a runoff 2 weeks later when you've got number one and number two slugging it off. But it's Emmanuel Macron who stands a very fat chance of being re-elected. He wants Marine Le Pen to run because he knows he will win against her.
There is one question about who Macron's likely to face. The way you describe things, though, Elizabeth, it's more interesting, this idea that the left has fallen away completely from the electoral picture, and that I think what we call in this country the Overton window, the sort of the discourse of the window that surrounds the parameters that surround the sort of acceptable discourse, it's moved in France. It's moved to the right.
Oh, it has moved to the right, but you have to realise that it was far less to the right than, say, the discourse in Britain. Zemmour has never said anything that was remotely beyond what the Daily Mail does every day. You can tell me that they're not candidates, but Nigel Farage did not say many things that Zemmour would not have said. So that was, to some extent, there's a bit of sort of going back into a general feeling in Europe, which started in 2015 when immigration suddenly became a problem. Until then, we had lived like Britain with waves of immigration that actually helped the country build, cars and houses, and there was the sort of overturn of the situation which had been slowly brewing since the years of François Mitterrand in the 1880s and 90s, and now it's become a major issue in the elections. And what's very interesting is all the candidates for the Republican primary, the people over whom Valérie Pécresse won. These are all the successors of Jacques Chirac. These are people they kept on sort of applying policies that were stronger than anything that even Zemmour has said. They wanted one of them, Éric Ciotti, who probably will be the Home Secretary if Valérie Pécresse is elected, says that he wants a French Guantanamo for people who've overstayed their welcome in France or never had a visa and commit crimes, so that even if they have committed a crime and they've already done their prison term, then they have to be sent to a place indefinitely. Valérie Pécresse herself was very strong about migration. This is a woman who is, she's really sort of on the left wing of the Républicain Party. So that window really has been suddenly moving in an incredible way. They were all fighting about law and order, which is something that was almost a dirty word in France 5 years ago.
And Elizabeth Moutet, lovely to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Thanks a lot. Well, as we keep reminding you, the cost of living is rising and rising sharply here in the UK. Wages going up, as Boris Johnson's government's been keen to remind us, but wage growth has lagged behind inflation. There was a 4.2% rise in average weekly earnings. That's in the 3 months to November. That means inflation's outstripped wage growth for the first time since July 2020, wages not keeping up with price rises. What does that mean for people? What does it mean for politics? Joining me now, Chair of the Labour Party and Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities, Annalise Dodds. Annalise Dodds, thanks so much for your time. Do appreciate it. What does it mean for working families?
Well, it means for many working families that very long period of stagnating living standards, in fact, the longest period since Napoleonic Wars, is actually going to intensify because they may be seeing wages going up a little in some cases, but the prices that they have to pay for the basics, for their utilities, for goods in the shops, they're all going up. And I think disturbingly in Britain, we're not seeing action being taken by the Conservative government to face up to this. Obviously, Labour set out plans particularly to deal with the high cost of fuel, how we would use a windfall tax on the oil and gas companies to be generating that funding to help everyone, but particularly those who are the most hard-pressed and pensioners. Sadly, the Conservative government not taking any action like that right now.
Well, it's under pressure from its own right wing, isn't it? There are Conservative backbenchers who say, look, this national insurance increase, which is part of the mix of the cost of living crisis, if that's what it is, part of the mix is £300 in extra national insurance that families on average will be paying. I'm guessing you wouldn't touch that.
No, we wouldn't. We believe that's the wrong way to be generating the additional funds that social care needs, which is what the government said this was earmarked for, but actually it's not going to be going into social care for many years. Initially, it will just be going in to the NHS. We said that those with the broadest shoulders should be looked to when it comes to generating that additional funding. And we've also pointed out that actually many of the social care workers who'd be delivering that social care, because of this change, all they will be doing is paying more tax. They won't see any improvement to their pay, to their terms and conditions, to the work that they do. They won't be any better prepared to actually help the people that they devote their whole lives to be helping. So this really isn't the right way to be facing up to that crisis in social care.
One way, according to the Financial Times, that the government's looking at facing up to this crisis is effectively to use taxpayers' money to cross-subsidise the big energy firms, to insulate them from big increases in wholesale prices. What do you make of that?
Well, we think it would be far more sensible if actually we saw those record incomes that are going to oil and gas companies being used to alleviate that burden on working families. That's why we set out those plans for a windfall tax. Looks likely that we'll be seeing those companies posting record incomes for the year 2020 to 2021. Surely it's more sensible to look to those companies making record incomes than to taxpayers, particularly to those low and middle income taxpayers who are already seeing national insurance, of course, going up. They're seeing the personal allowance also being frozen. They're seeing council tax going up. And as we've just been talking about, they're seeing their prices going up as well. So they're really being hammered from all directions under this Conservative government.
Well, what do you say to those people when it comes to energy prices and energy policy? We are just not the author of our own destiny, and we need to be. And we've had the opportunity, and it's not just Conservative government or previous Labour governments. There's been a policy failure stretching back decades now to really grip the big problems around energy supply. What would Labour, for instance, do when it comes to nuclear power, this idea that there needs to be some provision of baseload energy within the national grid, and nuclear is the best and most reliable way when the wind isn't blowing, the sun is not shining, to provide that?
Well, we've supported sustainable nuclear power. We've been very concerned by the lack of any proper plan for that sector. And of course, we've also supported sustainable renewables as well. We've had so much chopping and changing under Conservative governments. And I don't think this is all, if I might say so, driven by international and global factors. Actually, the UK is particularly affected by some of these global problems because we don't have as much control over our domestic energy supply as many other countries do. We've also got incredibly energy inefficient buildings compared to many other countries. You know, it takes a much shorter time for the average house in the UK to cool down than in most other countries that you might compare it with. You know, we're lagging far behind the bulk of other European countries in that. So there's a lot that should have been done, particularly over the last 10 years when we've seen other countries really harnessing the potential of renewables and building in that energy security. But we've not seen that taking place in the UK.
Annalise Dodds, can we just finally and briefly deal with the brute politics of the Prime Minister's future right now, and in particular some of the assaults that have been laid against him by your leader, Keir Starmer? I'm sure you'll have seen the Prime Minister today talking again and apologising again for what's been dubbed by some as Partygate. What do you say to those people who say the problem here is that they were all at it? Keir Starmer was seen drinking a beer when he ought not to have been. Should he apologise as well?
Well, no, because actually there's a very clear contrast between what took place in that photograph that people will have seen with Keir, and they can see for themselves that he was in the kitchen of another member of parliament when he was touring the country. He was having a bite to eat and a drink, stood up in that kitchen. You couldn't really be further away from what we've seen taking place in Downing Street, where we've seen repeated boozy parties that don't seem to have had that connection with work, that seem to have happened time and time again, that the Prime Minister's had to apologise for a number of times now, including to the Queen. So a very, very clear contrast between the way that Keir has behaved, always following the rules. He's actually self-isolated 6 times now because he's been following the rules, and the respect that he's held the British public in compared to the Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister.
We've got time actually just for one final question, and that is the question as to what happens now to COVID regulations as Westminster MPs vote on them. I'm looking at data today, and nobody would be foolish enough to say, OK, we've got Omicron on the run. But the data does seem to be telling now a coherent and consistent story about declining case numbers. I'm looking today, it's fallen below, this is for the entirety of the UK, below 6 figures, 94,000. In Scotland, hospitalisations down 21. So although there is a lagging indicator with fatalities, Scotland showing signs of hospitalisations dropping. Do you have any sense as the direction of travel now for the Labour Party when it comes to those regulations, whether it's governing things like mask wearing or vaccine passports? Are you persuaded, as many people are, that Omicron is a diminishing threat, that perhaps the case even for the threat it represented was necessarily overstated by some?
Well, as always, we'll be driven by what's in the interests of our country, of public health, of our economy, of our society. That's what we've always done when it comes to these decisions. So we haven't been driven by politics, we've been driven by what's been best for our country. But I would say also where I think there's a big difference between Labour's approach and the Conservative government's approach is that we want our country to be ready so that we can live with COVID into the future, and also so that we can live and cope with any other strains that might come to our shores and any other epidemics that might face us. That's why last weekend we set out a number of measures that would help to protect us in the future so that we wouldn't need to see the level of disruption and the huge impacts that we've seen from the COVID period in the future. And we have no such long-term plan, unfortunately, coming from the Conservatives right now.
Annalise Dodds, appreciate your time. Thanks very much. Scientists are warning that young women who consume little or no red meat and dairy are at risk of developing vitamin deficiencies that may lead to health problems in later life. A briefing from the Science Media Centre said that half of young women aged between 11 and 18 were consuming below the minimum recommended level of both iron and magnesium. Well, joining me now, Professor Margaret Raymond, a Professor of Nutritional Medicine at the University of Surrey. Professor, thanks so much for your time. I do appreciate it. This is such a real issue for lots of people, certainly for parents like me, teenage daughters, at least one of them. I do worry a little bit about what she's eating by not having any dairy or meat products. I know older women with osteoporosis, and I wonder whether there is a connection.
Yes, I think there is. And particularly what I'd like to mention first probably is vitamin B12. Anybody who cuts out meat and milk is losing that major source because B12 only comes from animal sources. And if you don't have enough of it, as indeed was found in a study on vegans in Oxford, about 50% of vegan women didn't have enough B12. And that can cause problems such as infertility, a type of anemia, fatigue, dementia, and also certain neurological symptoms like problems within the arms and legs, sort of tingling in the arms and legs. So, where are they going to get their B12? Actually, it isn't just meat, but quite a lot of it, it's very bioavailable from milk. So that's one problem. So, that's just one of the problems. The other issue is they will be low. If they cut out milk and dairy products, they're going to be pretty low on iodine. And iodine is vital because it's really important. If women are pregnant, they need iodine because it helps it helps the development of the brain of their child, and we've shown that in the study.
But we know there are lots of pregnant women who take supplements, and there are lots of vegans who take supplements too. Can they replace the missing nutrition from meat and dairy?
Indeed, they can. And actually, anybody who's decided that they're going to become vegan should really go on the vegan website. And there's a long bit on there about B12 and how important it is. And they'll be recommended to take the supplement that they themselves, the Vegan Society, suggest. So that would have in it certainly would have B12, it would have iodine, it has selenium, it has vitamin D, although, vitamin D we mainly get from being out in the sun rather than just food. But, the other things that are a problem, that although people eat a plant-based diet which has iron in it, it has zinc in it, it has calcium in it, one of the major problems is that there are other factors in a vegan diet, such as phytates and tannins and polyphenols of various kinds, and they will bind to iron and to zinc and to calcium and prevent you absorbing them. So it's not as if they're not in your food, they're there, but you can't get them into you. And this has been shown quite well in a German study on vegans, showing that although they took in enough iron, they didn't actually, their iron status was low.
Professor Margaret Raymond, who is Professor of Nutritional Medicine at the University of Surrey. Margaret, thanks so much for your time. It's a topic we'll return to, I'm sure, many times in the future. For now, thanks very much indeed. Good. Lots of you emailing in on this one. Lewis says, as opposed to the meat-eating women who are battling colon cancer, heart disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol and diabetes, why not just take supplements? Keep your votes coming in on our Twitter poll. More news coming up.
Hello again. Not much rain around recently, but most of us will see at least a little bit either tonight or tomorrow as a band of wet weather pushes south. Brighter skies will follow, but so will a fairly chilly breeze. The breeze has been fairly light recently thanks to high pressure, but weather fronts are now starting to edge in. This one's brought some wet conditions to Northern Ireland earlier and now spreading rain steadily across western Scotland. That rain could just trickle down into the far north of England for a time through this evening, and then more wet weather will arrive across Scotland and later in the night Northern Ireland. Much of the south, though, dry, but fog is likely to thicken up again this evening. Could be quite dense in places.